Today's video is about making some oil pigment sticks or oil pastels out of my foraged pigment that I've been using to make my dry pigment sticks or pastels using oil and wax. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between regular pastels, soft pastels, dry pastels, like the kind I've been making with my clays and pigments, and something called an oil pastel, which is made with oil and wax. It's not a crayon. Crayons are wax and pigment. This has some wax and oil in it, and I've started playing a little bit with making these with some of my forged pigments, but first I want to show you the difference. So this is a commercial dry pastel. It's chalky or soft and dry. This is a commercial oil pastel, and it, obviously you can't see this, but it is sort of sticky and it won't dry, not like an oil paint. So you can't varnish because of the wax in it. You can't varnish over the top of it. You actually have to frame these under glass. So dry and kind of oily, waxy. So I have been playing a little bit with trying to make some of these with my pigments. So I'm going to show you what my results are so far. These are the results so far, and I'll show you what they look like in paper in a minute, but I want to show you how I started. So I took some of my red ochre soil, clay soil that I processed using water, so it's very fine. No grit. It doesn't need any further grinding than this. It just needs to be incorporated into the oil. This is a marble plate that I was given that I'm using because I want to keep the oil stuff separate from my watercolors. So, like I said, this is a really fine powder already. And then I added some linseed oil to this and mixed it up and molded up. And I tried to get as much oil, much pigment into the oil as possible. So once I get the pigment incorporated into the linseed oil, I end up with what is technically an oil paint. Once it's smooth like this, I can start mixing it with the wax. And I used two different kinds of wax. I used a beeswax, or experimented with two different kinds of wax. Beeswax, and then this, which I think is pronounced carnauba. I've been pronouncing it wrong. But anyway, I use this one. It has a higher melting point than the beeswax, so it tends to make a harder stick that doesn't melt in your hand as much. And I will show you how I got the wax and this mixed together. So to get the oil and the wax and the pigment all to make a stick that you can use, you have to use heat. And heat enough so it melts that then I can pour it into a mold. I tend to like to repurpose things. I'm not sure this was the best way to do it, but this is a wax melting thing, and I just have an old Pyrex dish and I put everything in here and melted it up. It's really messy, and especially with the carnauba wax, it tends to harden as soon as it starts to cool, so you have to like mix it up and then dump it into the mold right away, and it basically you can get like one thing poured out with the small amount that I'm using before everything just hardens back up into this. So it worked okay, but there probably are better ways to do this. Now I'll show you the results of my experiments. Here are my results so far. first of all, this is just a pigment stick made with my processed clay pigment, processed with water so it's very fine particles, then had water added back in and rolled. And it's a nice, like a pastel, dusty and soft. The first time I mixed everything up and heated it, I just dumped everything in this bowl and put it in and then stirred it as it melted, and the pigment all sunk to the bottom because it didn't get mixed in. So I ended up with this really soft crayon-like thing with hardly any color in it. And I can feel the beeswax and linseed oil together, just even touching it, holding it like this, it melts in my hands. But I tried again, just adding more pigment and really mixing the pigment in with the oil first, and ended up with this. So a better color, more pigment, but still very soft. You know, the heat of my hands just melts it. So then I started adding to this mixture the carnauba wax, which is this, which has a higher melting point, so it's going to make the stick a little bit harder. And that actually was pretty good. It's still a little soft, but not quite as soft as these others. So then I added a little more carnauba wax, but by that time I had too much wax and not enough pigment, and I ended up with this, what is actually a pretty nice crayon, but very crayon-like and not oil pastel-like. So my last experiment was just linseed oil mixed with the pigment, like I showed you on that on the clip with the marble mulling plate. Linseed oil mixed with the pigment, and then carnauba wax added in and heated. And this one turned out the best. Good dark color, not nearly as soft so it's not melting in my fingers, but still oil pastel consistency. So these are my results so far.